Hello and welcome to the Leaving the Message YouTube channel, which is affiliated with the William Branham Historical Research website at william-branham.org. I have with me my very special guest today, Dr. Stephen Hassan, the leading cult expert and founder of the Freedom of Mind Research Center. And today Steve, you and I, we were just discussing this shooting that happened in Minnesota and comparing notes. I had no idea the deep connections that it had to my research. And one thing led to another. We both started talking. We decided, well, let's just get this out there for the public so everybody can hear what we're talking about.
John, you and I go back years, and you've taught me so much about the roots of this extremist pseudo-Christian latter rain, new Apostolic Reformation, all the things I talked about in the Cult of Trump book. And when I learned about the horrendous murder of two people in Minnesota and the shooting, I think they're going to recover, of two others. The media has he's now surrendered, so he's in custody, Vance Boelter. But the media's been saying he's a Trump supporter and a conservative Christian. And yet when we peel back the layers, your specialization with William Branham comes to the fore, because this guy apparently had an out-of-date website where he talks about Christ for the nations. And so I reached out to you and said, hey, buddy, your website, which is the most thorough researched background on the William Branham cult that exists, and there are millions of people who are still involved with offshoots of this Branham message group. And it's basically where this guy claimed to have visions and talked to God and made recordings. And people to this day think it's the Holy Spirit, etc. And it ain't true.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining, and especially thank you for reaching out and sharing the information that you had, because as we're starting to piece it together, like I said, this has a connection directly back to Branhamism. And through the podcast that we've been sharing with many of the other people, Charles and I are going through the revival history, which builds the background to most of what we're going to be talking about here in a few minutes. We've also been working with people who have came out of the IHOP KC, the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. Escapees from this movement, which are in the New Apostolic Reformation, had no idea that they were directly descended from this Branhamism, but they were. Yep. And as we're starting to piece all of these little bits of information that we're extracting from all of the people, combining it into organized research, we start to realize the thing that was created by this movement, not only is it dangerous from a cult perspective and hijacking somebody's mind, in cases like we're seeing here, it can actually radicalize somebody to the point where there's actually physical harm. So very excited to get into this with you, just to go through it so that people understand, because the news media is labeling this as a conservative Christian shooter. They want to brand it as though Christianity is the problem here, but it's not really that. So very excited to talk through with you and discuss that's different. That what they're describing is much different from the conservative Christians. This is actually a cult.
Yeah, and I just want to share with your new listeners, since the last time we've talked, which has been a couple of years, is that I got interested in the whole subject because I got radicalized in the Moonies cult in 1974 when I was 19 and a college student. And I had a radical personality change, and I would have killed on command or died on command without hesitation, because I wasn't thinking for myself. I had a pseudo identity that had hacked the real Steve Hassan. And if it wasn't for a near-fatal van crash and a voluntary deprogramming where I learned about Chinese communist brainwashing techniques, that I emerge going, how could I believe Moon was the Messiah and 10 times greater than Jesus? I was raised a Jew, and I didn't even believe in Jesus. And so I understand from the inside, unlike you who were born in it. I was radicalized at 19, and I've been following mind control research and helping people for 49 years. And so when I wrote The Cult of Trump for Simon and Schuster, I was in the room with Moon when he said, we're going to infiltrate the government, and God hates democracy. We're going to install a theocracy, and when we take power, we'll amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people who don't follow our rules. And I thought it was a great idea, because I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night, and I had phobias in my mind that demons were possessing me if I had a doubt or a hesitation. So I was so petrified about demons that I would just do whatever Moon or his leaders told me.
I can relate to some extent. We weren't radicalized to the point of physical violence, but we were manipulated and programmed such that no matter what the leader said, if we were told that it was some mandate by God, we would have done it. And there are people, there are people around the world who are in this Branhamism movement or its many splinter groups, and they will go out and inflict physical harm. But anyway, let's talk through a bit of the history behind this. You and I have had many conversations over the years. I actually have new information that I don't think that I've shared with you yet concerning all of the background to this, and it directly relates to this shooter. So in my research, whenever I was working first with you, I began to discover that William Branham was mentored by one of the key figures in the Ku Klux Klan. His name was Roy E.
You wrote a book
Davis.
about it, if I remember, John.
Absolutely. My first book, Preacher Behind the White Hoods, talks about this, right?
Yep.
Well, what I did, there were many pieces of this that I did not realize. And what I came to know after the research that I've combined with other people, I wrote another book, which I don't know if you've read this one or not. It's called Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the New Apostolic Reformation, the NAR.
Nope, but I need to interview you on my podcast and promote that book too, please.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So here is some of the information that I have not yet shared with you, and it is directly related to this. Whenever Roy Davis, who was the second in command of the Klan, mentored William Branham, they were starting a religious cult, and they started it here in Jeffersonville. It became my grandfather's church, but it was also more of a political cult than it was a religious cult. They were wanting to change politics, and the purpose of the change was for this movement called Christian Identity. This movement, you're very familiar with it, but for anybody who isn't, Christian Identity, it was a direct descendant of British Israelism, wherein people who were in this mindset believed that the British Isles, and by extension the Americas, were descended from the 12 tribes of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. This developed into a racially charged doctrine wherein they believed that people with black skin were the enemy, and this turned into a big, big mess. Well, these Christian identity conferences were held all throughout Canada, all throughout the United States.
And John, may I just add, this is the Ham doctrine is involved with the racial stuff back to, because the Moonies were teaching that too, that the black people are Ham, and therefore they're not blessed like white and others are.
Absolutely. One of the key elements of Christian identity is that in the biblical Garden of Eden, Eve mated with the serpent, and that produced Cain. His offspring were all black-skinned, and then when it came to the Great Flood, it continued through the lineage of Ham. That was the doctrine. So fast forward just a bit. You have all of this Christian identity mess, which is very politicized in the era. Well, one of the key figures who is speaking in identity conferences was a man named Gordon Lindsay. He was one of William Branham's campaign managers, and he helped lay the foundation that developed into the New Apostolic Reformation. He created a system wherein you could create new apostles and prophets, and they were all advertised in this magazine that was called The Voice of Healing, which this was William Branham's magazine initially. Branham started it as I think he called it an inter-evangelical magazine of the Branham campaigns. Gordon Lindsay came in, took it over, and he basically created a pyramid scheme out of this, where he and Branham were at the top, and then all of these evangelists joined into it. Through this magazine, they were able to promote this doctrine, and many of the key themes that we see in Christian identity, except for the racist ones, they did withhold those. Many of the key doctrinal themes made it into this magazine, while Gordon Lindsay himself is speaking at Christian identity conferences. So if you look at the NAR today, how dangerously politicized it is, this was the equivalent of the NAR back during the era in which this was going on. Well, Gordon Lindsay, over time, as Branham grew too much larger than the magazine could hold through his revivals, Gordon Lindsay started focusing on creating a network wherein he could train other individuals. This eventually became Christ for the Nations Institute. And as you just shared with me, Christ for the Nations Institute is the institute that trained Vance Boelter.
Yes, and just to add another detail to connect it to Trump, because this guy was a big Trump supporter, Paula White Cain, who's Trump's spiritual advisor, who got all these NAR people to back Trump, is the White House spiritual advisor, and she claims to be a prophet and speak to God and send her money because she needs more money.
So after you understand that history and you understand what was being created, William Branham and Gordon Lindsay were creating a network in which they could take different evangelical leaders, some of them claiming to be apostles, some of them claiming to be prophets, some institutions, ministers, etc. They created a network in which they could communicate with each other and share doctrinal positions with each other. And then this developed into actually what we see in the New Apostolic Reformation, where they have these apostolic networks. So all of this foundation was laid to enable the New Apostolic Reformation to flourish. Before William Branham died, he and Gordon Lindsay started holding these seminars, teaching people how to, they called it deliverance seminars, how to cast out demons, essentially. And I've got in my room, I'll have to share this with you sometime, I've got a book from one of these deliverance ministers talking about how the demon of hiccups can be cured if you do X, Y, and Z, or the cataracts. If you have the demon of cataracts, you can do this. Well, this is the kind of thing that was being taught. And so everybody who joined into this network could get a certificate as a quote-unquote deliverance minister, then go all throughout the networks casting out demons and wowing the crowds. Well, those deliverance seminars is what actually developed into the Christ for the Nations Institute.
Yeah, so again, we go back to the murder of a Democratic lawmaker by allegedly Vance Boelter because he believed he was doing God's will and they were baby killers, and because he believed Trump was, God's person on earth.
Well, Steve, I take strong offense to the way that media has branded this thing. They're saying that this is conservative Christianity, and therefore, by extension, if you follow that out to its logical conclusion, every single person who is a conservative Christian could be a potential shooter. I don't see that. That is not what this is. This is a person who has been radicalized. I was in a movement that radicalized people and that manipulated their minds in such a way that they could do something like this if you told them to. I came out of this, you came out of this. I see this as much different. What would you say to explain to people who are looking at this news that this is not conservative Christianity? This is something different. What would you say?
I think I'd like to say that for the media, they really need to do responsible reporting and not just say talking points like Christian conservatives, but be able to start understanding the difference between mainline Christianity that emphasizes Jesus's teachings, and I might add the Pope's messaging, and Pope Francis's messaging is closer to than what the prosperity ministers and the NAR and the Branhamites are doing, and to understand how minds can be radicalized and people move to violence because of violent rhetoric. So it's called stochastic violence, I believe. It's like talking about violence. And we don't want more political violence. So if we really want to de-escalate what the bad actors who want to bring America to civil war are doing, we really need to name what's ethical, love-based, honesty, transparent, accountable versus deception, dogma, phobias, hate speech. And we all are human beings on the same planet, and we need to live together.
Well, thank you so much for doing this, Steve. Thank you. I'm sure our audience is going to be grateful to understand that this is not conservative Christianity. This is something else. And thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, and I'll just invite people to freedomofmind.com. I'm cult expert on a number of different platforms. I too have a YouTube and I have a podcast. And I want people to come to you at williambranham.org and your podcast, Leaving the Message. We really need to educate whoever's willing to learn what the facts are about the history of what's happening now in the United States and around the world.